The howl in the pines. People like to talk about how peaceful the forest is. The fresh air, the towering trees, the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. I used to believe that too. But after what happened last summer, I can't look at the woods the same way anymore. I'll start from the beginning. My buddy Eric and I had planned a weekend camping trip in Black Pine National Forest. It's a sprawling expanse of dense trees, rocky trails, and isolated beauty. No cell service, no distractions, just nature. We were looking forward to it. 2 days away from the noise of the city, under a canopy of stars. It sounded perfect. It wasn't. We set up camp near a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The air smelled of moss and earth, and the only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the occasional creak of branches swaying in the breeze. The first night was uneventful. We laughed around the campfire, cooked some hot dogs, and swapped stories until the fire burned low. By midnight, we were zipped up in our sleeping bags, lulled to sleep by the gentle whisper of the forest. But the second night, that's when everything changed. It started with a sound. At first, it was faint, like someone stepping on dry twigs far off in the distance. Crack, crack. "Did you hear that?" Eric whispered, sitting up in his sleeping bag. I nodded, my heart thumping in my chest. "Probably just a deer," I said, more to convince myself than him. But the sound didn't stop. The cracks grew louder, closer, until they seemed to circle the perimeter of our campsite. Whatever it wasn't shy. Eric grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating branches and shadows, but nothing else. That's when we heard the howl, and it wasn't a wolf. I've heard wolves before, and this was different. It was low and guttural, rising into a pitch so sharp it made my ears ring. It wasn't the kind of sound an animal should make. Eric and I froze, our eyes locking. Neither of us said a word, but the fear in his face mirrored my own. "Maybe it's a coyote," Eric muttered, though his voice was shaking. But deep down we both knew that wasn't a coyote. The howling stopped as abruptly as it began, leaving the forest eerily silent. Too silent. Not even the crickets chirped, and the usual rustle of nocturnal life had vanished. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, moving slowly but steadily toward our tent. I gripped the hatchet we'd brought for chopping firewood, my palms slick with sweat. Eric held the flashlight like a weapon, the beam trembling as he pointed it at the sound. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking. No answer, just the footsteps. And then the trees began to move. At first I thought it was the wind, but the way the trees swayed, jerking back and forth as if something massive was pushing through them, it wasn't natural. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a low, rumbling growl. It vibrated through the ground, through my chest, making the air feel heavier, thicker. "Pack up. Now," I hissed, grabbing my backpack. Eric didn't argue. We stuffed everything we could into our bags, abandoning the tent and fire pit as we bolted toward the trail. But the forest didn't want us to leave. The path we'd taken to get there seemed to stretch endlessly in the dark. Our flashlight beams barely pierced the shadows, and the howling started again. This time, closer. Much closer. Branches snapped behind us, loud and violent, as if something was chasing us. We ran faster, my legs burning, lungs screaming for air. And then I saw it. The flashlight beam caught it for just a second, but that was enough. It was massive. Easily 8 feet tall, hunched over, its limbs too long, its body too thin. Its eyes glowed like embers, staring straight at me, and its mouth was full of teeth. Not like an animal's teeth. These were jagged and uneven, sharp enough to tear through anything. It let out a screech, a horrible, piercing wail that sent every hair on my body standing on end, and lunged toward us. We didn't stop running until we burst out of the tree line and into the parking lot where Eric's truck was parked. We jumped in, slamming the doors, and sped off without looking back. For miles, neither of us spoke. We just stared at the road ahead, the silence in the truck broken only by the sound of our ragged breathing. Finally, Eric whispered, "What the hell was that?" I didn't have an answer. The rangers called us a few days later. Apparently, they'd gone to check out our campsite after finding the abandoned tent. They said it looked like a bear had come through, torn up the ground, claw marks on the trees, the works. But we know it wasn't a bear. I don't know what we saw in those woods. Maybe it was just nature, twisted and angry. Maybe it was something older, something we weren't meant to disturb. But one thing's for sure, I'll never go camping again. And if you hear howling in the woods at night, don't look, don't run. Just pray it doesn't find you. The lake's secret. People always talk about how calming lakes are. The mirror-like surface, the gentle sound of lapping water, the peaceful quiet. That's why I agreed to the trip. A weekend getaway with my girlfriend Mia to a secluded cabin by Stillwater Lake sounded like the perfect way to unwind. But Stillwater isn't like other lakes. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The drive took hours, winding through dense forest and narrow dirt roads until the GPS gave up entirely. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon and the lake shimmered in the fading light. "Wow," Mia said, stepping out of the car. "It's so still." She was right. The lake was unnaturally calm. No ripples, no waves. It was like a sheet of glass, perfectly reflecting the sky and the surrounding trees. I should have felt at ease. Instead, there was a weight in the air, a heaviness I couldn't shake. The first night was uneventful. We unpacked, cooked dinner, and sat by the fireplace listening to the occasional hoot of an owl outside. But when I woke up in the middle of the night, I heard it. A faint splash. It was so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it, but when I looked out the window, the lake wasn't as calm as before. Small ripples spread across the surface, breaking the perfect stillness. Something or someone had been in the water. "Probably a fish," Mia said the next morning, brushing it off. She was always the logical one, and I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I let it go. We spent the day kayaking. The lake was eerily cold, even under the midday sun. The water was so clear you could see straight to the bottom. Rocks, weeds, and something else. "Hey, do you see that?" Mia pointed, her paddle dipping into the water. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I spotted it. Something pale and smooth, half buried in the silt. It looked like a hand. "No way," I said, laughing nervously. "It's just a rock." Mia wasn't convinced, but we kept paddling. Still, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale shape under the water. It wasn't a rock. I knew it wasn't. Then came the whispering. At first, I thought it was Mia talking in her sleep. But when I turned to look at her, she was out cold, her breathing steady and even. The whispering was coming from outside. I crept to the window, my heart pounding, and peered out at the lake. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the water, which was no longer still. Ripples spread across the surface in deliberate patterns, almost like something was moving underneath. I woke Mia. "What is it?" she mumbled, groggy and annoyed. "Listen," I whispered. The whispering had grown louder, a chorus of voices blending together, speaking words I couldn't understand. Mia's eyes widened as she heard it too. "We're leaving," she said, grabbing her coat. But as we opened the door, we froze. The lake wasn't just rippling anymore, it was boiling. Bubbles rose to the surface, hissing and popping, though there was no heat, no steam. The whispering grew into a deafening roar, and then we saw them. Figures, rising from the water, pale and glistening, their faces featureless but for deep, hollow eyes. They moved unnaturally, their limbs too long, their fingers clawed. One by one, they turned toward us. "Back inside!" Mia screamed, slamming the door shut. We barricaded it with a chair, but the cabin felt flimsy, like it wouldn't hold. The whispering was inside now, crawling under my skin, filling my head with thoughts that weren't my own. They wanted us to come outside, and I could feel it. A pull, a compulsion to open the door, to walk to the lake. Mia grabbed my arm, shaking me. "Don't listen to it." Her voice snapped me out of the trance, and I realized my hand was already on the doorknob. "We need to go," I said, but the car keys were gone. They're in the kayak, Mia cried, realization dawning. We'd left them behind during the trip. We had no choice. As the figures closed in, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark, we bolted for the lake. The whispers turned into screams, sharp and piercing, as we reached the kayak. The figures didn't chase us. They just stood at the edge of the water, watching, waiting. We paddled out as fast as we could, the whispers fading as we put distance between us and the shore. But then, the water beneath us started to ripple. It wasn't just the paddle strokes. Something was moving below, circling the kayak, and then it hit us, a massive jolt that almost tipped us over. Mia screamed, clutching the sides as I frantically tried to steady us. A hand, a real human hand, reached up from the water, grasping the edge of the kayak. We didn't make it back to shore. I don't remember how I got out of the water, but when I woke up, it was morning, and I was lying on the ground near the cabin. Mia was gone. The lake was calm again, perfectly still, like nothing had happened. But I could still hear the whispers, and when I looked into the water, I saw her face. It was pale, smooth, and featureless. Hollow eyes stared back at me, unblinking. Mia is still in that lake, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear her voice calling me back. Don't go to Stillwater Lake. It's not peaceful. It's not calming. It's hungry. The lake house shadows. I swear it started out as the perfect weekend. Just me, my girlfriend Erin, and a cozy lake house her family owned, miles away from the city and all its chaos. No cell service, no distractions, just us, the water, and the stars. I was actually excited. I needed the break, but if I'd known what was waiting for us, I never would have gone. The lake house was tucked away at the end of a narrow, overgrown path, surrounded by thick woods. It looked exactly how Erin described it: small, rustic, and charmingly run down. When we arrived, the sun was just setting, painting the lake in shades of gold and orange. I remember thinking how quiet it was. So quiet you could hear the soft lapping of water against the dock. Erin was beaming, unpacking groceries in the tiny kitchen while I stood on the porch, taking it all in. That's when I noticed it. A shadow. Long and thin, it flickered across the water, moving quickly, too quickly to be a cloud or tree branch. I laughed it off. Probably just a bird, I thought. The first night was off. We tried to light the old fireplace, but the flames wouldn't catch. The power flickered constantly, and the air inside the house felt stale, like it hadn't been opened in years. By the time we went to bed, I felt this nagging sense of unease. Erin, of course, was unbothered. She fell asleep almost immediately, but I couldn't. The mattress creaked with every movement, and the house groaned like it was settling, though it felt more alive than it should. And then came the tapping, and it started faint. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, staring at the window. Something, or someone, was tapping on the glass. "Erin," I whispered, shaking her. She groaned, half asleep. "What? Do you hear that?" The tapping stopped. She listened for a moment, sighed, and rolled over. "It's probably a tree branch. Go to sleep." But it wasn't a tree branch. The window was bare and there wasn't a single tree close enough to touch the house. The next morning, Erin acted like nothing was wrong. She cooked breakfast, laughed at my paranoia, and dragged me down to the dock for some swimming. The lake was eerily still, its surface like glass. While Erin floated on her back, staring up at the sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I scanned the tree line, squinting at the dense shadows between the trunks. That's when I saw it again. A shadow, long and thin, darting between the trees. "Erin," I called, my voice tight. She splashed around, grinning. "What now?" I pointed toward the shore, but it was gone. By nightfall, the unease had grown into full-blown dread. The house felt colder, darker, even with the lights on. The tapping returned, louder this time, echoing through every window. And then there was the hum. Low and guttural, it vibrated through the floorboards, rising and falling like a distant chant. "What the hell is that?" Erin whispered, clutching my arm. I didn't answer. My eyes were fixed on the window, because outside, in the darkness, something was moving. We didn't get a clear look at it, just flashes, tall, spindly limbs and glowing eyes that seemed to hover in midair. I grabbed Aaron's hand. "We're leaving, now." We bolted for the door, but the second we stepped outside, the air shifted. The lake, the trees, the stars. It all felt wrong, like we'd walked into another world. And then we heard it, a voice. "Stay." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The word echoed in our heads, pulling us back toward the house. Erin froze, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, gripping her hand tighter. "Don't stop. Keep walking." The shadows around the house stretched and twisted, forming unnatural shapes. The voice grew louder, angrier, overlapping with whispers and groans. "Stay with us. Stay forever." By the time we reached the car, the world around us was unrecognizable. The trees were black, their branches clawing at the sky. The lake was boiling, churning with thick, inky waves. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. The shadows were closing in, faster now, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. The engine roared to life, and we sped down the path, the house vanishing behind us. We didn't stop driving until we were back in the city. Erin refuses to talk about it. She pretends it never happened. But I can't forget. Sometimes late at night I hear the tapping again, and when I close my eyes I see the shadow, waiting for me to come back. The whispering campground. You ever hear your name whispered when no one's around? I never thought much of it, chalked it up to tricks of the mind. That is, until the weekend I spent at Hollow Pines campground. Now, every time I hear my name whispered, my stomach turns. Let me tell you why. It was supposed to be a simple trip. Just me and my buddy Kevin, a couple of tents, and 2 days of fresh air and fishing. Hollow Pines was tucked way out in the middle of nowhere. No cell service, no traffic, no noise. Just miles of forest, a small lake, and a few scattered campsites. We were the only ones there. At first it was peaceful. Kevin set up the tents while I got the fire going. We cracked a couple of beers and laughed about how off the grid we were. But that first night, as we sat by the fire, I started feeling off. The trees seemed closer than they had during the day, their shadows stretching and shifting with the flickering flames. The silence was so heavy, it felt like it was pressing down on us. And then I heard it. "Jake." It was soft, so soft I thought I'd imagined it. I looked at Kevin, but he didn't seem to notice. He was busy poking at the fire, muttering about how we should have brought marshmallows. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He glanced up, confused. "Hear what?" I shook my head. Nothing. But it wasn't nothing. That night I barely slept. The forest came alive after dark, branches creaking, leaves rustling, something moving just beyond the campsite. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear it again. "Jake." It was closer now, more distinct. A woman's voice, soft and breathy. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Kevin?" I hissed. He groaned from the other tent. "What?" "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" "That voice." He groaned louder, clearly annoyed. "It's the wind, dude. Go to sleep." But it wasn't the wind. The next day I couldn't shake the unease. Kevin acted like nothing was wrong, dragging me to the lake and joking about how pale I looked. But even out in the open, under the bright sun, I felt it. The sensation of being watched. The trees seemed denser, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. The air was heavy, humid, and thick with the smell of damp earth. When we got back to camp, I noticed something strange. The fire pit, which we'd doused before leaving, was smoldering again. And around it, in the dirt, were footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet, too small to be Kevin's. "Very funny," I said, glaring at Kevin. He looked genuinely confused. "What are you talking about?" "The footprints." I gestured to the fire pit. He stared at them, his face paling. I didn't do that." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Then who did?" That night, the whispers started earlier. "Jake." "Kevin." It wasn't just my name anymore. It was his too. We sat by the fire listening, our heads swiveling toward every rustle and creak. "Maybe it's an animal," Kevin said, his voice shaky. Animals don't whisper, I snapped. The forest fell silent like it was holding its breath. And then from the shadows we heard it again. Come closer. Kevin bolted for his tent, muttering something about needing sleep. I stayed by the fire, gripping a stick like it would actually protect me. The whispers circled the campsite, weaving in and out of the trees. Jake! Kevin! Why did you come? The flames flickered, shrinking as if the air itself was being sucked away. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the firelight, half hidden by the shadows. Pale skin, tangled hair, and eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. She wasn't moving, just staring at me, her head tilted slightly, like she was curious. Kevin! I shouted, scrambling to my feet. He stumbled out of his tent, his face a mask of confusion and fear. What the hell's going on? I pointed toward the trees, but she was gone. Did you see her? I asked, my voice trembling. See who? The rest of the night was a blur of whispers and shadows. We didn't sleep. Every time we closed our eyes, the whispers grew louder, the shadows crept closer. By dawn, we'd had enough. We packed up as fast as we could and practically ran to the car. The forest seemed alive, the trees swaying without any wind, their branches reaching for us. When we finally got to the road, I turned back for one last look. She was there, standing in the middle of the path, watching us leave. I haven't been camping since. Sometimes late at night I hear the whispers again. Jake. And every time I swear I can feel her watching me, waiting for me to come back. The Whispering Woods. Have you ever been to a place that felt wrong? I'm not talking about creepy vibes or an old abandoned house. I mean a place so heavy, so unnatural, that your instincts scream at you to leave. I never believed in any of that, until I got lost in the Whispering Woods. It started as a simple hiking trip. Just me, my buddy Josh, and his dog, Bandit. We'd planned to spend the day exploring an off-the-beaten-path trail deep in the mountains. Josh had heard about it from some blog, something about untouched wilderness and a hidden beauty. The trail wasn't marked on any map, but Josh was confident. Trust me, he said, grinning as we parked at the edge of the woods. I should have turned back when Bandit started whining the second we stepped into the trees. At first, everything seemed normal. The air was crisp, the leaves were vibrant shades of orange and red, and sunlight filtered through the canopy above. We joked, snapped photos, and followed the narrow dirt trail winding deeper into the forest. But as we went further, the air grew heavy. It wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the hum of insects. The only sounds were our footsteps and Bandit's low whimpers. You feel that? I asked Josh. He nodded, his grin gone. Yeah, it's like the air's thicker here. The trail disappeared after about an hour, swallowed by the forest. Josh swore we could bushwhack our way through, but every direction looked the same. Identical trees stretched endlessly, their branches twisted like gnarled fingers. That's when we heard it. A faint whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but there was no breeze. The air was still. Did you hear that? I whispered, glancing at Josh. His face was pale. Yeah. Bandit growled low, his ears pinned back. The whispering grew louder the deeper we went, but it wasn't coming from any one direction. It was all around us. A soft, murmuring chorus of voices just out of reach. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Warning, anger, hunger. Josh stopped suddenly, pointing ahead. Do you see that? Through the trees, a clearing opened up. In the center stood an old wooden cabin, its roof sagging, its windows dark. Let's check it out, Josh said. No way, I snapped. We need to turn around. This whole place is wrong. But Josh was already walking toward it. Bandit refused to follow. He sat at the edge of the clearing, barking frantically as we approached the cabin. I should have stayed with him, but I couldn't let Josh go in alone. The door creaked open with a touch, revealing a single room filled with dust and decay. The walls were covered in strange carvings, spirals, jagged lines, symbols I didn't recognize. And then we noticed the smell, rotten, metallic, alive. Josh gagged, covering his nose. What the hell? That's when the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut on its own. Josh? My voice wavered as I reached for the handle. It wouldn't budge. Then the scratching started from inside the walls. It was faint at first, like nails dragging across wood, but it grew louder, more frantic. Josh grabbed my arm. We need to get out of here now. But the carvings on the walls, they were moving. The symbols twisted and writhed like living things, rearranging themselves into new shapes. A spiral split into an open mouth. Jagged lines formed skeletal hands. The air turned icy. My breath came out in white puffs, and I swear I felt something brush past me, something cold and wet. Then I heard it. My name. Whispered softly directly into my ear. "Let's go!" Josh yelled, throwing his weight against the door. It finally gave, and we stumbled out into the clearing. But the forest wasn't the same. The trees were closer, their trunks blackened and charred as if burned. The ground was soft and spongy, oozing dark liquid with every step. The whispers had returned, louder now, urgent and angry. Bandit was gone. "Bandit!" Josh called, his voice breaking. No answer. Then we saw him, standing perfectly still at the edge of the clearing, staring at us. His eyes reflected the pale moonlight. But something was wrong. They weren't his eyes. "Bandit?" Josh stepped toward him, but I grabbed his arm. "That's not your dog," I whispered. Bandit, or whatever it was, tilted its head unnaturally, its movements jerky, like a marionette on strings. And then it opened its mouth, not to bark, to whisper. The same voices we'd heard in the woods spilled out of its mouth, layered and disjointed. Words overlapped, incomprehensible yet undeniably menacing. Josh froze. What's happening? I didn't answer. I couldn't. The whispers turned into laughter, cold and mocking, as the thing that wasn't Bandit took a step forward. We ran. Branches clawed at our faces, roots snagged our feet, but we didn't stop. The laughter followed us, echoing through the trees, growing louder and more distorted. I don't know how long we ran before we burst out of the forest and onto the dirt road where we'd parked. The car was there, but the forest wasn't. Behind us, where the trees should have been, was nothing but open field. No trail, no cabin, no sign of the whispering woods. We didn't speak the entire drive home. Josh never went hiking again. He doesn't even talk about that day. As for me, I still hear the whispers sometimes. When I'm alone at night, when the house is quiet, they call my name. Softly, patiently, waiting for me to return.